So today we'll be talking about Chapter 6, Section 3. And the title of this section is Jefferson Alters the Nation's Course. We've been talking about this division. We've been talking about these extreme different views. Anti-Federalist versus Federalist. And of course it became Democratic Republicans versus Federalist. And the United States during Thomas Jefferson's presidency, if you remember, he's the guy who founded the Democratic Republicans. So we're talking about a major party shift in American politics in our early stages. So it's a big shift. But also during this time, we're going to be talking about how the United States expanded its borders during, most importantly, the presidency of Thomas Jefferson.
Good job, Seth. You broke it.
That was my fault.
John Adams is a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who wants to start a war with France. While he's not busy importing mistresses from Europe, he's trying to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George. Haven't we had enough monarchy?
I'm Thomas Jefferson. I approve this message because John Adams is a hideous, hermaphroditical character, neither the
These are
force
real
and
things,
firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman.
If Thomas Jefferson wins, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed. The soil will be soaked with blood and the nation black with crimes. Are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames, female chastity violated, children writhing on a pike?
I'm John Adams, and I approve this message because Jefferson is the son of a half-breed Indian squaw raised on hokies, and Hamilton is a Creole bastard brat of a Scotch peddler.
Those were real campaign posters, newspaper publications, etc. So you think our campaign is nasty. That was the election of 1800. And this was between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now you have to remember that John Adams was our second president. So this is the incumbent running for re-election. And this is the president running against the vice president. Do you remember that part? Where Thomas Jefferson came in second place, and so he got to be the vice president, and these two now have to work in the awkward same office, and they're calling each other these things? I mean, really? And that's the election of 1800. And it was a bitter campaign, if you didn't just realize that. And it was a really close campaign as well. In fact, you could argue this was one of the very closest elections in our entire country's history. It was an electoral deadlock. You see, in the popular vote, Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams. However, he came, in the electoral vote, which the Electoral College you learned about in civics, hopefully you still remember something about. So the electoral vote, Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams. However, he came within a dead tie in electoral votes with Aaron Burr. Now, Aaron Burr versus John Adams, dead tie. There is a solution. We can't just have two presidents. There was a time in history where there were two popes and they both sentenced each other to hell. It doesn't work out so well. True story. There were two popes, they both excommunicated each other. In their minds, they sentenced each other to hell. Again, it just doesn't work so well when you have two bosses. And so we have to have a winner. In this case, it goes to the House of Representatives, our Congress. And so if we can't choose a president, if the electorate can't choose a president, we have to decide it in Congress. It's the only time this has ever happened. 35 times Congress voted on who should be our next president. 35 times they came up with a tie. I mean, really. It's scary thinking about it. That our country, that young, we'd only officially started in 1789, and now 11 years later, we can't pick a sodden leader. I mean, we can't. We can't figure out who's supposed to run our country. 35 times. I mean, imagine if the news were printing this today. Imagine if that was on your social media feed. That we can't pick a leader 11 years later. And so Alexander Hamilton realized that for our nation to continue, for us to have a stable government, he would need to change his vote from Aaron Burr, who was a Federalist, to Thomas Jefferson. And so he broke the tie. Jefferson won. Aaron Burr was very upset by what just happened. He should have, by all rights, won the election. Alexander Hamilton ruined it for him. And so what do you do in 1800 if someone disgraces you? Well, first you go knock on the door of their house. You open the door, or your servant opens the door, either way. You then produce a glove, and you slap the person in the face with it.
Although I'm not really going to try and hit her.
Now, what does that mean in 1800? That means someone is going to die. You have invited the other party to a duel. You agree to meet at a set time, and then you meet the next morning. End scene. Very good. Next scene. You meet the next morning. You have agreed upon an objective third party to serve as the referee. The referee will then allow you the choice of weapons. You choose between cannons, spears, knives, swords. You have chosen pistols. A smoothbore single-shot pistol. These usually only have one shot, and then they must be reloaded, and it takes quite a while to reload. You then agree to flip a coin to see who gets to fire first. True story, this actually happened. I'm not making this up. So, select heads or tails.
Heads.
Heads.
Tails.
Tails. And Alexander Hamilton wins the coin toss. He gets the right to fire first. Now, the moderator is going to have you stand back to back. And the moderator is going to count to 10, and you are going to take paces. And 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, you are going to turn and fire. But Alexander Hamilton doesn't want to kill Aaron Burr. He believes this needs to be settled peacefully. So Alexander Hamilton fires his shot into the air. Fires the shot into the air. Aaron Burr, seeing the opportunity, levels the gun at Hamilton's chest, shoots and kills him dead. Graveyard dead. Hamilton is dead. However, this is considered a disgraceful act since Hamilton fired his pistol into the air. Aaron Burr shot and killed an unarmed man. So disgraced, Aaron Burr flees off into the territories never to be seen again.
Disgrace.
While Hamilton perhaps saved our country, this revealed a severe flaw in the electoral process. And in fact, it led to the passing of the 12th Amendment. And what this did was allowed electors to cast separate ballots for the president and the vice president. And so the awkwardness of having number 1 and number 2 in the same office was solved. At the same time, it prevented the nasty possibility of a tie in the Electoral College. But I wanted to show you an election map from 1800. Obviously, you can see there are no territories west of the Mississippi, not yet, though we'll add some territory today. But if you also look, you see that the Federalist, John Adams, gained most of his support from the northeastern states. And the Democratic Republican, Thomas Jefferson, had the locked-in support of the southeast, as well as some of the, what we would call western states at that time. They would have been considered a little further west than the coast. were solidly for the Democratic Republicans. And so you can see the beginnings of this sectionalism here exemplified in a presidential election. Just like we will see the continuation of sectionalism, unfortunately, in our presidential election in November. The solid red South versus the blue states, right? Unfortunately, sectionalism still exists. But nonetheless, Thomas Jefferson won the presidency. And it does represent a profound political shift, because the president does have an enormous amount of power. For example, Jefferson replaced all the Federalists in the White House, all these cabinet-level positions, with Democratic Republicans. Jefferson reduced the size of the armed forces, if you read in your book, to a paltry amount. Essentially a handful of officers equipped to train a militia if we are attacked. And so the military was cut to almost nothing. And he cut all social expenses of the government. So the government would not maintain roads, would not do anything to benefit people, period. Our tax dollars in Jefferson's mind were to only go for promoting the common defense and protecting the rights of the American citizens. In doing so, he was able to eliminate all taxes on American people. All taxes. Now, how can you do this? You see, our federal government maintains an interstate highway system, maintains Medicare, Medicaid, maintains Social Security, a large military, and a number of other national concerns. And so how can you just cut all of that? Well, Jefferson said these matters were concerns of the individual state. And the federal government can be small enough to not even have to tax the American citizen. He believed that all taxes necessary for the functioning of a federal government can be collected through international trade by means of tariffs. As president, he reduced the influence of the Bank of the United States, and he was also the first president to take office in Washington, D.C. And he wanted, though wealthy, though an aristocrat, with land and wealth and servants and a great deal of education, he wanted to be seen as a man of the people. And so when he took office in the first southern capital that we've ever seen, he wore work boots and he dressed in working man's clothes. And so he actually chose to walk to his inauguration in working man's clothes, and he chose to dress that way throughout his presidency. So instead of suit and tie, he would have wore Carhartts and boots. And this is beginning what we call the Southern dominance in politics. And so throughout Jefferson's presidency, we do see a true decline in the power of the Federalist Party at this time.
Countrymen. Our third president, Thomas Jefferson, was elected to the high office by the House of Representatives in 1800, since there was a tie in the number of electoral votes between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. When Jefferson succeeded John Adams as president, it was one of the few times in modern history that a peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another had occurred. Jefferson was already well known as the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. As president, he arranged for the Louisiana Purchase from France and more than doubled the size of the United States, and built his own mansion that he called Monticello. He was a champion of political and religious freedom.
Now, as you heard in the video, this was one of the very first times there had ever been a major transition in political power between two such differing ideologies. And it occurred without a single death except for Hamilton. And that's That's a big deal. That's worth pointing out, that we can have a peaceful transition of power. That if in this election you are not happy with the winner, it would be seen as a horrible thing if you were to commit a violent act as a result. Yet, prior to the election of 1800, it would have been seen as commonplace for people to commit violent actions if there was a major transition in power. Because we're talking about a real change, an ideological shift in our country. Federalists are losing their jobs, they're losing influence, and in fact, the Federalist Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, had served for more than 30 years as the head of our judicial branch. On John Adams' last day as president, he pushed through Congress a law called the Judiciary Act of 1801. So his very last day as president, we call this a lame duck president, meaning that if an incumbent president loses, those last few months from November to February between the election and the inauguration, they are called a lame duck president, meaning the people chose to vote them out of office and they only have a couple months left. And so they're not typically expected to do very much that's important in those last 2 months. They're called a lame duck, meaning nobody wanted them there. It's clear the American people don't want them there. And yet John Adams, instead of sitting and doing nothing or writing his memoirs or whatever, he pushed through a law which added 16 federal judges. And so the hope was this was really his last chance to preserve a legacy of the Federalist Party before Jefferson comes in and just mucks up the whole business. Now, Jefferson argued that these, quote, midnight judges, as he called them, were invalid. That these undelivered appointment papers, these orders that were given on the very last day that he was president, were invalid. In fact, he said, you're just not allowed to do that. It's unconstitutional. And so, the Supreme Court had to investigate. Because after all, it is their job to determine if an action of the president or if an act of Congress is unconstitutional. And so William Marbury, a Federalist, sued in court to have these papers delivered. He argued that even though it was Adams' last day as president, he was still the president of the United States and he still had the right to pick federal judges. In fact, the Judiciary Act of 1789 had already established the right of the Supreme Court to carry out their duties. In fact, it not only created the Supreme Court, it established the specific duties of the Supreme Court. And so John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, ruled that this requirement to have these papers delivered was in fact unconstitutional. That you can't just do that on your last day of office. And so this was the very first time that the Supreme Court had convened to override a presidential executive order and to declare it unconstitutional. And that precedent of overriding a president in a matter involving the Constitution is called judicial review. It was the very first time the Supreme Court had ever done that. But even the Supreme Court may override a president or Congress if something they try to do violates the Constitution. Again, that's called judicial review, and that's a very important precedent that was established in this case.
The election in which Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams for president has been called the Revolution of 1800, because that year control of the executive branch of government shifted from the Federalist to the Democratic Republican Party. Up until 1800, Federalists had always controlled the presidency. After the election of Thomas Jefferson, a revolutionary new set of ideals based on a smaller role for the federal government went into effect. John Adams realized that the loss of the presidency meant that his party's influence had been drastically reduced. And so he used his remaining weeks in office appointing judges who held strong Federalist views so that Federalist ideals would be preserved long into the future. These appointees came to be called the Midnight Judges. One of these men, John Marshall, would serve as the powerful Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for 34 years. And it was under Marshall's guidance that the U.S. Supreme Court finally achieved the same level of power possessed by the executive and legislative branches of government.
Now, during the election of Thomas Jefferson, a great number of Americans began to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, if you were looking at the election map, it does show that there were these sparsely populated territories between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. But during Jefferson's presidency, these places were growing in population and today are thickly populated areas. I mean, Illinois was a territory at this time. Now it contains Chicago, one of our largest and most important cities. And so from 1800 to 1810, the population of Ohio alone contains, by 1810, 250,000 people. Now, as settlers were moving westward, most were using the Cumberland Gap to reach Ohio. And the Cumberland Gap is a large gap in the Appalachian Mountain chain, large enough and flat enough for settlers to move from the East Coast without having to cross the Appalachian Mountains over into Kentucky and Tennessee. And now the Cumberland Gap is where the Cumberland River flows through. If you've ever passed through that area, think of I-85 from Knoxville connecting to I-26 around Johnson City. If you try to cross the Blue Ridge Mountains here in a wagon, good luck. No roads at all, no trails really to speak of except for a few hunter trails or game trails. And so crossing the Appalachian Mountains by foot in 1800 ain't happening. Yet there was an explorer named Daniel Boone, one of my favorite people in American history, who discovered the Cumberland Gap. He was a hunter. He was a traveler. He explored all of this land, walked all over it, and he found this gap in the mountains large enough for people to move through in large numbers. Think hundreds of thousands of people moving west through this area. He discovered a flat enough valley that people could move through in great numbers. And he spent the rest of his life as a guide getting settlers safely across the mountains through the Cumberland Gap into places like Kentucky and Tennessee with very fertile farmland, helping them get established. So Daniel Boone helped clear the Wilderness Road, which is today the Cumberland Gap. He's an amazing man, amazing stories. You should pick him for your topical project. There are trees all around Middle Tennessee and throughout the mountains with his name carved on them. In fact, there's one in the Big South Fork in what's a little place, you think here is small. Think of the Valley of the Three Forks of the Wolf in the Big South Fork. And you'll find, if you dig around enough, a tree where it says D. Boone killed Barr on tree in 18 something something. Anyway, neat stuff. I think he's amazing. So meanwhile, we've been talking about foreign affairs yesterday. And you may remember that Napoleon tried to conquer the world. And that European countries were so concerned about this, in fact, they gave up many of their overseas possessions and began selling off their colonies and making deals with the United States to avoid conflict with us because they wanted to focus their efforts on Napoleon. Well, Napoleon was also giving up his overseas possessions. And When Louisiana was returned to France as a result of a deal with Spain, Thomas Jefferson was afraid of Napoleon as well, because he had essentially conquered Western Europe. But a turn of events worked out in our favor. A slave colony called Haiti rose up in rebellion and won their independence. They were a French colony, and then they became independent, and the slaves rose up and killed their masters and declared Haiti an independent nation. And as a result, Napoleon was so frustrated from dealing with that insurrection that he realized that it wasn't worth the resources to maintain an overseas colony, especially if the United States were going to continue to move into these territories. And so he sold off the Louisiana territories, which in a moment you'll see how big this is, to the United States for a few $1,000,000. I think $15 million was the agreed upon sum. And this doubled the size of the United States. Now, $15 million was a lot more back then, and Napoleon needed the money to continue to fight this war and finance his campaigns. But the Louisiana Purchase was perhaps one of our biggest wins here. There was one problem. No one really knew the area that well. Doubling the size of the United States, that's huge. And yes, there were Native Americans living there. And so we needed to know, among these Native American tribes, who would be friendly, who would work with us, who would cooperate and live peacefully with us, and who might try to stab us in the back, who might try to kill us, etc. But also, are these lands safe? I mean, are there grizzly bears there? Are they going to kill us all? Are these lands hospitable? Can we set up farms? Can we build roads? Can we settle this area? Or is it some kind of Siberia that we purchased? You know, we need to know information, beta about this land before people are going to begin to move there. And so Thomas Jefferson personally appointed Lewis and Clark to lead the Corps of Discovery. And I think this is an amazing story in itself. Lewis and Clark were tasked with exploring the Louisiana Territory, which was the size of the existing United States at this point. So they were said, go, wander the country. We need you to make maps. We need you to find an overland route to the Pacific Ocean. We need you to gather as much information as you can. We need to know about the people living there, the plants living there, the animals living there. Are there giant beasts that are going to eat us all? And with them traveled a Native American woman named Sacagawea, who served as their interpreter. She didn't speak all of the languages, but they had enough of a common thread she could often figure it out. And she served as their guide. In all honesty, they probably wouldn't have made it without her. And so next I just wanted to show you the Louisiana Territory. And this also shows you a little about the Lewis and Clark expedition. For example, the expedition started in St. Louis, like I said, an important city. But the Louisiana Purchase here you see put next to the existing United States is almost as big as the existing United States. And by the end of their journey, and you don't have to read all of this, but by the end of their journey, they will have spent 2 years exploring the Louisiana Territory. They will have made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They spent a winter at the Pacific Ocean at Fort Clatsop, a fort they established, and they will make it back. Not all of them, but most of them. Make it back. And they produce maps and information, and they write books, and they're famous, and everybody considers them a hero. Because now they have some of the most usable information of what might as well have been another planet at that time. In fact, we even made a movie about these guys. This was Chris Farley's last movie before he died. It's called Almost Heroes. You should watch it. It's silly, it's funny, but it follows the story of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And that's Dave Chappelle and David Arquette, if you don't know.
One thing you will discover when you get next to one another is everybody some elbow room, elbow room. It's nice when you're kinda cozy, but not when you're tangled nose to nosy. Oh, everybody needs some elbow, needs a little elbow room. That's how it was in the early days of the USA. The people kept a-coming to settle, though the East was the only place there was to go. The president was Thomas Jefferson. He made a deal with Napoleon. How'd you like to sell a mile or two?
Or 3 or 100 or 1,000.
And so in 1803 the Louisiana Territory was sold to us without a fuss and gave us lots of elbow room. Oh, elbow room, elbow room. Got to get us some elbow room. It's the West or bust. In God we trust. There's a new land out there. Lewis and Clark volunteered to go. Goodbye, good luck, wear your overcoat. They prepared for good times and for bad, and for bad. They hired a Sacagawea to be their guide. She led them all across the countryside, reached the coast, and found the most elbow room we've ever had. The way was opened up for folks with bravery. There were plenty of fights to win land rights, but the West was meant to be. It was a manifest destiny. The trappers, traders, and the peddlers, the politicians and the settlers, they got there by any way they could. The gold rush trampled down the wilderness, the railroads spread across from east to west, and soon the rest was opened up for good. And now we jet from east to west, goodbye New York, hello LA. But it took those early folks to open up the way. Now we've got a lot of room to be growing from sea to shining sea. Guess that we have got our elbow room, elbow room. But if there should ever come a time when we're crowded up together, I'm sure we'll find some elbow room up on the moon. Oh, elbow room, elbow room. Got to get us some elbow room. It's the moon or bust. In God we trust. There's a new land up there.
All right, just for fun, and you might see this on your quiz, which statement best, the key word there is best, remember that's the big trick on a lot of your test questions, explains why the exploration of Louisiana Purchase was important to the future of the United States. This is a tough one, because here's the truth. All of these are correct. However, one is better than the others. Yes? Perhaps? See, I don't think you'll see this one on your quiz. I think long ago I took it away for this very reason, but the state once included this on the final exam. It was B. Yeah. Just in all fairness, I think I removed that one from your quiz because I was like, really? Because I would have chose D, honestly, but anyway. The state chose B.
You should
but
just as a joke, just put them all right.
Yeah.
And just